Good morrow, everyone, and welcome to Shakespeare and Friends, the series in which we engage with some of the big questions surrounding Shakespeare and early modern history. I'm Darren Freebury-Jones, and my co-host is Rachel Aanstad, and I'm really excited, Rachel, about this topic that we're discussing in this session because it's not a topic I've ever written on or researched or taught. So I've got a feeling I'm going to learn an awful lot in this episode. And the question for today's episode is, what was on Shakespeare's menu? So, what are your thoughts on that one, Rachel? Food during the early modern period.
Well, first of all, I'd say that anybody who's eaten has done a fair amount of research in terms of what food entails and what it means and how that can impact a dramatic narrative. And in a sense, food is one of the most accessible ways into Shakespeare. You really don't need to have written a paper on food in Shakespeare, although people have done some wonderful work. Not minimizing that wonderful scholarship at all. But as an audience member, um, when Timon of Athens feeds his no good friends a bunch of mud clods and they were expecting a fancy dinner, we understand their disappointment immediately. We don't need that explained to us. And so that's one of the reasons why I really like to talk about food and Shakespeare, to give people that self-confidence that really there's an awful lot about Shakespeare that they can instantly relate to without having to have done a bunch of research and stuff. All that said, there's a lot of really fun, nerdy information to be had here. And I think one of the first things to, really kind of get under our belts, as it were, is that the food that a lot of times that we associate with Britain is not food that Shakespeare and his audiences would ever have tasted. They didn't have potatoes. They didn't have corn the way we think of it. For them, corn was any grain. So corn could be barley or wheat or rye or anything, but the word corn didn't really get attached to maize until maize showed up. So some of the foods from the Americas and from well, I want to say the Americas mostly. We're talking about the Colombian Exchange, where things like um, avocados, of course, chili pepper, cocoa. They had no chocolate. They had no stimulants in medieval or very early modern England. There was no coffee. There was no chocolate. There was no tea. There was nothing like that. They didn't even have tobacco until after the Columbian Exchange. So you had a whole continent of people who could never get their buzz on. And I like to think about what a shock that must have been, in the 17th century. And as these coffee houses sprung up and everything else, no wonder there was a revolution, right? All of a sudden, they all had coffee and chocolate and tea to get them worked up about stuff. So some of the other foods that would have been new would have been tomatoes. It took a long time for people to think tomatoes were okay to eat. And to be fair, a lot of people don't digest tomatoes very well. So there was some merit to that. Potatoes in particular, of course, very important to the British diet now and pretty much everybody else's diet, but completely unknown. And it took a long time for people to eat potatoes. They were just feeding it to their livestock for decades, uh, which, is just tragic if you think about it, really. All these
I was
people.
going to say, Rachel, on the topic of potatoes, because one of my favorite Shakespeare lines involves a
Hmm.
potato. So Shakespeare was familiar with them, I think. And you have in the Merry Wives of Windsor, Sir John Falstaff is
been tricked essentially into meeting Mistress Page and Mistress
Mhm.
Ford, and he thinks he's going to get his end away. And he says, "Let the sky rain potatoes." So my sense is that potatoes were seen as something of an aphrodisiac, even though they hadn't probably quite exotic
It,
food stuff that not
it
introduced into England till about 1586, I think.
it could be, people tended to view anything exotic as an aphrodisiac. But,
Yeah.
we also have to be careful when we're talking about lines from comedians that maybe they're saying something kind of the opposite, uh,
Mm,
of what it should mean. So he's saying, let it rain potatoes. Well, if potatoes weren't valued, you know,
mm,
why isn't he saying, to my mind, if he was going to an aphrodisiac, I would guess he would say peaches or
mm.
cherries or, something that kind of really hits that point home. So I don't know what that means about the potatoes. That's a really good point. Um,
But to the modern ear, and having seen the plain performance, whether you know what the connotations are, it's a hilarious
it's
line. It's
hilarious.
just that image of the sky raining potatoes.
And, potatoes is a funny word. Maybe he just liked the sound of it.
Yeah.
It, we don't we don't necessarily know, but it is a wonderful image, raining potatoes. It just implies a wonderful abundance to us of thank heavens for all these potatoes. Let's see a few other ones that, you know, were not present in Europe, like sunflowers, um, cranberries, peanuts, pineapples, of course. And then, we took our foods and planted them invasively in the Americas. And, uh, so it goes. But I think everybody's happy to have potatoes and onions. And I think that was probably our most valuable gift to each other from one continent to another. We gave the Americas, or I'm in America too, but Europe gave the Americas onions, and the Americas gave Europe potatoes. So, with that in mind, one of the most important ways that people decided what to eat was based on Homeric theory. And we'll probably come back to this at some point when we talk about medicine, or maybe just an episode on the humors. But basically, this was an old-fashioned uh, medical theory, old-fashioned to us, archaic to us, but not at the time, very prevalent at the time, that went all the way back to ancient Greece. And I promise not to go too deep in the weeds there. But basically, people were thought to be composed of four liquids. And so those were yellow bile, blood, phlegm, and black bile. And these four things had correspondences with the elements and whether or not something was hot or wet or dry or cold. And uh, the best was to have a balance of all four, but almost nobody does. And so people would eat foods that they thought would balance that out. So if you had a phlegmatic personality, if you were sort of damp and cold, then they might tell you to eat hot, dry foods like black pepper. And I think barley was another hot, dry food. And, the logic of this, of what is hot and dry and wet and cold, uh, feels a little arbitrary to us in a sense, in that they were looking at what the food was before you ingested it, not always the effect that the food had on you, if you understand what I'm saying. So, but over time, they had hundreds of years to develop this theory. They did find certain correspondences. But if you had too much choler, if you had too much fire and you were hot and dry, then they might ask you to eat a more phlegmatic food like a melon, something cool and moist to help calm you down. And there are worse dietary theories. out in the world. And so people abided by this for centuries. And this is why when you look at a medieval or a Renaissance feast, there's so many dishes because each person had to pick and choose the dishes that were good for them at that particular moment. So nobody was expected to eat everything. Everyone was expected to consume the foods that they knew would work best for them at the time. And so it's really no different than, if you go to a Thanksgiving in the United States now, and it's a big feasting holiday, and if you have a lot of family members, then you need something for your gluten-free people, and you need something for your vegetarians, and you need something, for your family member that will only eat meat and potatoes and will never touch a green vegetable. And people complain about this, and I understand it's a lot of work, but it is the way humans have been for a very long time. We have always kind of catered to our loved ones' dietary needs in this fashion, if we could afford to, to the best of our ability. So, one of the foods that I think has a particularly interesting historiography is black pepper. And
Mm.
if you would, I would love you to read this Falstaff line where he compares himself to a peppercorn.
Okay, I shall give it a go. And this is from Henry IV, Part 1. Falstaff says, Bardolph, am I not fallen away vilely since this last action? Do I not bate? Do I not dwindle? Why, my skin hangs about me like an old lady's loose gown. I am withered like an old apple John. Well, I'll repent, and that suddenly, while I am in some liking. I shall be out of heart shortly, and then I shall have no strength to repent. And I have not forgotten what the inside of a church is made of. I am a peppercorn, a brewer's horse, the inside of a church.
Okay, so there Falstaff is he's as if waking up, right, to realize that he's led this kind of dissipated life, right? That he's probably gotten to the ripe old age of 36 or something, and all of a sudden is, realizing that he can't drink all night and party all day and still feel okay. And he feels like a peppercorn. And it's a very graphic image, all kind of wrinkly and round, you know. Uh, but Pepper was going through an interesting phase at the time that Shakespeare was writing, because for many years, pepper was used as a form of currency. So, one of the landmark events that is oddly very rarely talked about is the Great Bullion Famine, when the silver mines of Europe basically just kind of dried up and all the silver was flowing to the east because they didn't want a British wool. They didn't need any of the things that Britain really had except silver. And Britain wanted their spices, wanted their pepper, their saffron, all of the herbs and spices and the cumin, all of the drugs, opium and everything else that they needed that came from the Levant and farther east. And of course, the silk and the embroideries, all these luxury goods that came out of Asia and the Levant. And so what happened is that all the silver basically went away. There wasn't any to make coins out of. And the wealthy people who had silver, they hoarded it and made it into dinner plates. And so when you see something like in Richard II, where Bolingbroke, Henry IV, is complaining because Richard II and his cronies, was it Bagot, Bushy, and Green, took all his plate. he's not complaining about his china. He's not, he's not complaining about his dinnerware because he has nothing to eat on. He's complaining because that was how people stored their wealth. And, not only was it like an easy way to carry it around, but it was a consistent weight, and you could show off to your neighbors how rich you were whenever you fed them dinner on your gold or silver plate. So all of the rich people took all the silver and gold they could find and made it into dinnerware. And there was nothing for the mints to use. And so they debased the coins and everything else. Anyway, getting far afield, but people started using pepper as a currency instead because it's really hard to fake. It's hard to make a fake pepper. By the time you make something taste like pepper, you've had to put so much pepper into it. It may as well be pepper at that point. There isn't really anything else with that flavor. And it stays, it doesn't rot. It's easy to store, it's lightweight. And so people were using peppercorns as a medium of exchange. And because it was so hard to get, the price remained, in a sense, pretty stable, although it kept going up and up and up as silver and gold became less and less available. And, people would exchange uh, goods with pepper. They would pay their rent in pepper. They would pay their employees in pepper. And so people had these pepper stores in terms of storing, keeping their pepper safe. They had special pepper boxes um, and everything else. But then the Portuguese found their way to India, and the price of pepper started going down. And then the Dutch went over there and started getting pepper. And pretty soon, the English were going over there and getting pepper. And the price of pepper crashed. It was a crisis. It was the pepper crisis. And so, people who had been storing, their riches in pepper for years, all of a sudden lost everything. Not everybody could move over to silver fast enough. The silver, fortunately, was coming back thanks to the Spanish going to the Americas, and then the English taking the silver from the Spanish, basically, is glorified piracy. So at the time that Shakespeare was writing, pepper had been this incredibly valuable thing for centuries. And all of a sudden, by 1609, was practically worthless. In the period from, the 1590s till the first decade of the 1600s is when the price dropped. And so when Falstaff is talking about being like a peppercorn, he's talking about more than just the fact that he's kind of round and wrinkly. He's also talking about how, he used to be something of great value and he no longer is.
Mm.
He's now something very common. And anyway, little poignancy to add to that. I think we have um, one more pepper quote here. So, peppering also because people would take meats and stick pepper all over it. And so, peppering came to mean being stuck with a lot of different holes. And as people started using gunshot, then people, a pepper box was something that had ammunition or gunpowder in it, but that was all kind of after Shakespeare. But we have a wonderful line from one of my favorite characters ever, Mercutio.
Yes. And it's the moment of Mercutio's demise when he says, "No, 'tis not so deep as a well, nor so wide as a church door, but 'tis enough. will serve. Ask for me tomorrow, and you shall find me grave man. I am peppered, I warrant, for this world. Plague are both your houses.
Just joking till the end, you know?
Yes, he loves a pun, Mercutio, doesn't he?
He really does. And the poor guy thought he was in a romantic comedy
Yep,
and
he was for a couple of acts, yeah.
found out in in Act 3 that oops, he's in a tragedy. So, um, yeah.
So peppered essentially means you're done for.
You're
Is that what it
done
came to
for.
mean?
It came to mean that you're poked full of holes. So,
Yes, yeah.
he's been peppered with holes. Uh,
Mm.
I think another myth that persists that I'd like to get rid of, the idea that people used pepper to disguise bad meat.
Ah,
Nobody would do that. You would not put incredibly expensive pepper on a bad cut of meat. If,
mm.
first of all, people didn't let meat go bad. Um, they ate it as fast as they could. Secondly, it was really only wealthy people that could afford large cuts of meat. And so if they covered it in pepper, it was because it was good meat and they wanted to show it off and feed their guests and everything else. But they did put a lot of pepper, a lot of pepper on their food. They made ginger cookies, which were, it seems like a quarter ground black pepper would go into these kind of ginger cookies. And they're kind of more of a candy in a way. And there's a wonderful website that I will provide a link to, which I'm sorry I've forgotten the name of off the top of my head, but there will be a link to it in the show notes. And she has a wonderful recipe for ginger cookies with pepper in them if you're
Would
feeling
sound
like
delicious.
trying
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah, that's dessert sorted tonight, I think.
So we know that Shakespeare wrote with intention, and any good playwright does. You have a certain amount of limited time on the stage, you have limited actors, they have limited capacity to remember lines, I guess, unless they're Richard Burbage. And so we can really talk about how does Shakespeare use food? What is he using it to express in certain situations? And a lot of the time that includes social standing. And as I mentioned earlier about Timon of Athens feeding his no good friends mud, that communicates really clearly what he thinks of them at that moment. And Hamlet has some equally disparaging lines about what was served at a meal. So would you read that for us, please?
Of course. Thrift, Horatio. The funeral baked meats did coldly furnish forth the marriage tables. Would I had met my dearest foe in heaven, or ever I had seen that day, Horatio. My father, methinks I see my father.
So the funeral baked meats is a pun because coffin meats were meats inside of like a pastry.
Mm,
A coffin was a container. It wasn't necessarily something that just dead people were in. And so not only is he saying, hey, they reused the food from the funeral for their wedding, but he's also talking about a specific kind of food that could keep a long time. So you would take your leftovers, bake them in the bread, keep them somewhere cool for a while, and they would be good a week or so later when you wanted to serve them again. Uh, but, it doesn't seem like they were putting out a big spread to make everybody feel welcome in their in their new marriage as part of this new community. Um, and then bottom has a wonderful series of
Oh, no,
lines.
I would just add a bit more on
Yeah,
Hamlet, I think,
yeah,
because
thank you.
Hamlet is a fascinating play in terms of references to eating. So you have lines such as "eat a crocodile" or "now could I drink hot blood." And something that struck me thinking about this recently is the fact that Hamlet, as Polonius says, fell into a sadness and then into a fast. So Hamlet is essentially
Mm,
fasting, which I think is indicative of his grief. And there are some very interesting references to eating or fasting in Shakespeare's sources for Hamlet. So in Francois de Belforest's 1570 version of the Hamlet or Hamlet tale, Hamlet is refusing to eat with Fengon, the
mm.
Claudius counterpart, and which reminds me a little bit of Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, where he says to the Christians, "I will not eat with you." And you also have this very striking moment in terms of eating in Saxo Grammaticus, the Danish historian's version of the Amleth myth, where Polonius, the Polonius counterpart, is cut up and fed to pigs, which I think Shakespeare was very
Yeah.
wise to avoid that essentially. But you also have Shakespeare referring to common myths when he's writing about Hamlet as a fasting character who is quite disparaging towards meat. So Hamlet at one point says that he feasts on the chameleons dish. Promise crammed, you cannot feed capons so. So capons being an emasculated chicken, essentially. So
Mm.
I think Shakespeare's referring to that belief that goes back to the likes of the natural historian Pliny, that chameleons could feed on the air. So it's fascinating insights into some of the belief systems during the period concerning eating or fasting.
Oh, very much so. It's an important thing to think about. You know, what the presence of food means also implies a lack of food. And
Mm,
how do those two states play against each other, especially in a
mm,
culture that was suffering from constant food shortages? You know, there
mm,
were often bread riots in the 1590s. There are just
mm.
a lot of people and hard to get enough food into the city. So,
But it's a curious speech, that, isn't it? That speech about being thrifty and funeral baked meats, because gluttony very much seen as a vice, wastefulness seen as a vice, and yet recycling the meats from the funeral for the
mhm,
for the wedding feast. I think that hints at a sense of moral decay in Elsinore.
it really does. And I'm going to try to, not get too far afield here, but at the time, the Danish had a reputation with the British for being cheapskates. And
Mm,
the reason for this was because, the Danish controlled the Sound. um, they had land on both sides of it, and so they could charge, and they did, people tolls uh, going in and out of the, dang it, which sea is that? Is that the Black Sea? Oh,
geography was never my strong suit. I don't think it
oh.
was Shakespeare's either. So,
No, I disagree there. I disagree there.
okay,
But anyway, but we'll talk
but
about
another
that
episode perhaps.
another episode. Yeah, yeah. Oh, I am all about Shakespeare's geography. But anyway, I apologize. So, uh, I'll flash it up on the screen when I edit, which sea it is. I'll save myself that way. Um, in any event, they wanted to get through there and had to pay the Danes to do it. And the Danes charged the English the same thing that they charged their, sworn enemies, the Spanish. And this was not the way anybody else did business. You gave your allies a better break for shipping costs than you did your worst enemies. It was a form of tariff, right? Which we're struggling now with the politics we have in our country. So, uh, the English were, and the British, the Scots too, um, were annoyed with the Danes for not um, giving them the customary um, favors of a favored nation status. And there was even some suspicion that maybe the Danish weren't really allies, that maybe they were actually in league with the Spanish if they were going to be charging the Spanish the same thing as the British. And so I often wonder if Shakespeare's characterization of Hamlet and of the court at Elsinore um, was partly indicative of this, of those cheapskates, you know. they, you
Hmm.
know, we're not sure we can trust them because they're charging us as much to get through the sound as they are the Spanish. So interesting. Okay, let's see, shall we move on to Midsummer Night's Dream?
Absolutely, yes.
So I had these split up into two things, but I think we'll come back to Bottom because otherwise it's confusing because his lines come after Titania's. But um,
Okay.
one of the things that Shakespeare did was use fruits and nuts, aphrodisiacs, basically, to connote a sexual relationship or at least an intimate one between two characters. And so there is a scene. It's when the lovers they're all arguing with each other. You know, some of them have been enchanted with the flowers, some of them haven't, and Helena is pleading with Hermia because she's saying, "Look, we used to be friends," and there's quite a bit about the speech that sort of implies maybe uh, there was, a strong romantic component. It certainly implies a great deal of intimacy, whether that manifested in what we would call a sexual relationship or not, I think is kind of beyond the point. And it's really hard to compare their idea of sexual intimacy with ours today. But if you would read this line of Helena's.
We Hermia, like two artificial gods, have with our needles created both one flower, both on one sampler, sitting on one cushion, both warbling of one song, both in one key, as if our hands, our sides, voices, and minds had been incorporate. So we grow together, like to a double cherry, seeming parted, but yet an union in partition, two lovely berries moulded on one stem. So, with two seeming bodies but one heart, two of the first, like coats in heraldry, due but to one and crowned with one crest. And will you rent our ancient love asunder, to join with men in scorning your poor friend? It is not friendly, 'tis not maidenly. Our sex as well as I may chide you for it, though I alone do feel the injury.
Oh,
A
poor
lovely
Helena.
speech.
It is, and I couldn't bear to cut it. Even though the topic ends after the cherries, I'm like, no, I want to hear the whole
It,
thing.
it wrote to the barbers, to quote
Yeah.
Hamlet.
So, there y- we can see how he uses fruit so effectively to show that
Mm,
kind of, close emotional bond between two characters.
mm,
And then there's a lot of fruit, there's a lot of food, there's a lot of loving in Midsummer Night's Dream. So then later, Titania has fallen in love with Bottom due to the magic potion. For any of you who somehow have not seen Midsummer Night's Dream, never had it forced upon you at any point in your life. Um, but Titania is in love with this strange creature, and she's telling her fairies to collect him some delicious snacks.
mm. Finally, I get my shot at playing the Queen of Fairies. Here we go.
Yay!
Be kind and courteous to this gentleman. Hop in his walks and gambol in his eyes. Feed him with apricots and dewberries, with purple grape, green figs and mulberries. The honey bags steal from the humble bees, and for night tapers crop their waxen thighs, and light them at the fiery glowworm's eyes, to have my love to bed and to arise, and pluck the wings from painted butterflies, to fan the moonbeams from his sleeping eyes. Nod to him, elves, and do him courtesies.
Oh my goodness. And then scroll back in the notes a little bit and but what does Bottom want to eat?
Well, it's crammed this speech with aphrodisiac and fruit that suggests virility and fertility and abundance. And I'm struck
Mm-hmm.
by apricots, for example, in terms of
Mm,
beliefs surrounding apricots. So apricot seems to come across here to me as an aphrodisiac. But the one
definitely.
example of apricots in early modern drama that would first spring to my mind, it wouldn't be A Midsummer Night's Dream. It would be John Webster's The Duchess of Malfi,
Mm-hmm.
where you get the malcontent Basola essentially identifies that the Duchess is pregnant because she has an appetite for apricots. So that was seen as a sign of pregnancy, and apricots apparently could even induce labor.
Well, I wonder if that was dried apricots because dried apricots will make you fart.
Oh, actually, now you say that, I remember. Uh, my mother said, "Oh, apricot's very good for you," and gave me a bag of them. And I think with apricots, you need to eat them sparingly. And I wasn't aware of this, and I ate the whole pack,
They're
and
delicious.
they were delicious, but the consequences were less so.
We're
Yes,
not comfortable. Yeah.
no,
So,
no, you've brought back memories for me.
well, one of the things that they give to women who are about to give birth, if they want to make the labor go quicker, is cod liver oil because it
Yeah.
has the same effect. And so
Mm,
apricots did that naturally and more deliciously, I might add. Um,
mm,
and then, the dewberries and the grapes and the figs and the mulberries, all of those have strong aphrodisiac and romantic connotations. She
and
starts
intoxication in terms of grapes, which
definitely,
which can lead to amorous pursuits, of course. Yeah.
definitely, definitely. And then, she's talking about bees and the honey bags and um it's just it's such a beautiful scene and such a
Mm,
picturesque scene uh
mm,
that you know we can almost see it really in our minds so clearly. Even if you can't visualize those things, you understand how you feel faced with a lush buffet of wonderful fruits. So um,
mm.
I think one
Mm.
of his most effective speeches.
And I find it so fascinating in terms of that contextual information, because I think for a lot of people, you would hear that speech today in the 21st century, and
Mm,
I don't think you would necessarily instantly pick up on those sexual connotations. That actually all these mentions of dewberries, mulberries, grapes, figs as well.
hmm
This is quite a sexy speech. And on the subject of figs, I was just thinking as well of Cleopatra's death, where you have the
mm,
the adder concealed within a bowl of figs, which
mm,
is very interesting given that Egypt and Cleopatra depicted in such a sensual way in Shakespeare's
hmm
tragedy.
And her relationship with Mark Antony is so sexual. They just
Oh
make a
yeah,
point of that over and over. And here she is, even in death, making the sexy choice, you
yeah,
know, a snake,
yeah. If you're gonna
a
go
s-
out, go out with a bang. Yeah,
go out
yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Because figs, if you open them up, they look more vulvic than some fruits
Yeah.
do. Although,
I'm never going to look at a fig the same way again after this episode, Rachel. So thank you for this.
wonderful, wonderful. Well, and hopefully peaches and apricots too. So,
Another thing that strikes me with fig, and I'm thinking of plays like Othello, is
mm,
fig was almost seen as trivial in terms of discourse. So you might say, "Oh, a
mm.
fig on something or other," and that was kind of equivalent to saying to equating something to a pin. I set my life on a pin's fee. So it's interesting how a fig is associated with triviality
Well,
as well.
I wonder if it's just a euphemism for fuck, because
Oh,
we know that it was.
mm,
I don't give a fig about that. Was a
yeah,
way of
yeah.
saying, because figs were so closely, uh, you know, searching for the word, but construed, linked with, the idea of sex and Adam and Eve and the fig tree
Mm,
and the fig leaves and
yeah.
everything else. And there's a very rude Italian gesture called the fig that basically means you should, fuck off.
Mm.
So, perhaps what he's saying there is something like, well, I don't give a fuck.
Is that when you thrust your thumb between your forefinger or something, isn't it? That
Yeah,
yeah,
I think it's
yes,
something like that. Yeah.
yeah. Ah, completely.
Let's see. So, but bottom uh is doesn't hear any of those sexual connotations either.
Mm.
So our audience can be forgiven if they didn't. Although usually the actress playing Titania makes it very clear what they mean by the things that they are saying to bottom. So, um, how does bottom respond?
He says, "Truly, a peck of provender. I could munch your good dry oats. Methinks I have a great desire to a bottle of hay. Good hay, sweet hay, hath no fellow." To which Titania responds, "I have a venturous fairy that shall seek the squirrel's hoard and fetch thee new nuts." And Bottom says, "I'd rather have a handful or two of dried peas, but I pray you, let none of your people stir me. I have an exposition of sleep come upon me."
Well, there's bottom missing the point again. She offers to give him new nuts, and
Mm.
oh, I'd rather have some dried peas. That's not very sexy. So
Well,
let's talk about. He asks for a bottle of hay, um,
mm,
and he's talking about beer. There, he's talking about ale, uh, and he's countering with these things that are known to decrease sexual desire.
mm,
Um, you know, dry oats, not really an aphrodisiac, not something you eat before a passionate encounter, generally dry oats. Uh, Beer also not known for its aphrodisiac qualities. And then he comes down to the dried peas. Again, this was something that you would eat if you were a little too excitable. Um,
mm,
those are all kinds of hot, dry foods meant to, uh, you know, help someone who was at a little too many fluids that they didn't know what to do with.
mm.
Um, let's see. So, any insights on ale and
Well, something as I was researching this episode that struck me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but ale and beer, there seems to be something of a gender distinction during the period. So ale was often more associated with women and domestic settings, and then beer became more associated with men, which I found quite interesting.
well, uh, beer was stronger.
Mm,
And they would make something called, well, let me see, I may be getting that confused. Um, they would make something called small beer, which is something
yeah.
that we would call ale now. And so people were generally just kind of mildly buzzed most of the time because they
Mm.
drank a lot of this very low alcohol content beer. And one of the reasons that they would do that is because in the process of making this small beer, you made barm. And barm is basically brewer's yeast that's been through the process, and it's all yeasted out. It's all, used its growth up in the fermentation of the beverage. And then they would take that barm and make bread out of it. And this was when people made barm bread, and there's different ways to define brown bread. So don't come at me, bakers, but you know, bread is a lot browner after you put barm in it. Let's let's put it that way. And it's a very high source of protein. And even now, as a vegetarian, I eat a lot of nutritional yeast, which is kind of a better tasting version of the same thing. So this process of making the small beer was really integral to their whole diet. And lots of people in this era were essentially vegetarians. They couldn't afford meat. And so they would add this brewer's yeast, this barm to their diet. And so you can be a vegetarian and really easily approximate an early modern peasant diet. You have to give up potatoes if you're going to be truly authentic, but root vegetables, turnips, uh, barm, bread, cheese, soft white cheeses predominantly, not so much hard aged cheeses, because you had to wait to eat those. And unless you had a huge excess of milk, you didn't have extra to have it sit around and need a way to preserve that. Mostly people ate these kind of soft white cheeses, goat cheeses, sheep cheeses, cow cheeses, anything that made milk pretty much, except humans. I don't think they made human cheeses, but who knows? Without getting again too far into the weeds there, um, nursing women were seen as a resource for anybody who was ill. Um, Somebody who maybe was elderly might be given a little bit of breast milk if they couldn't digest anything else or there wasn't anything else present. You don't let grandpa starve just because he can't digest. He doesn't want to think
Oh,
about that. But
This is all getting very titillating. Yes, yeah.
so we won't go too far into that. I don't want to gross anybody out. But, we need to understand that food didn't come neatly packaged from a grocery store. Food was life, food was survival. And so, if there were unpleasant worms in some of the food, sometimes you just ground that up and used it as protein. Sometimes you just threw it in the pot. If it wasn't going to hurt anybody, it's all just protein. And so, when we read Shakespeare, it helps for us to understand this visceral relationship that people had with the time for their food. Uh, if they wanted to eat a chicken, either they or somebody they knew had to kill that chicken. You know, they had a deep understanding of the fact that anytime you ate meat, that meant that another creature had died, and it meant that somebody else wasn't eating that. You were taking that food, in a sense, from someone else. And so when we think about these wealthy people just eating all this food, uh, that was a big part of their wealth. we think of wealth in terms of gold and jewels and all that, but food, there was no greater source of wealth than food. And so when we see that in Shakespeare, we see him use that as a status marker, without explaining it, because why would he, right? Everybody understood that at the time for sure. All right, I think I am. Oh, we were going to talk about strawberries.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Okay. So, we have some wonderful references in Henry V and Richard III, and also in Othello about strawberries. Um, we talked about it, the strawberries in Richard III, but then I was surprised to see the same bishop.
Yes. Yes. I was really struck by that.
So here he is in Henry V, and he's trying to provide a metaphor here.
And
So
this is the Bishop of Ely is the said bishop.
Ely, did I
Yes.
say Eli? Thank you. Ely.
Uh, no, you just said, "Oh, we've got the same bishop." But I was really struck by that. That yes, you've got
Yeah.
this strawberry-related bishop, both in Richard III and Henry V. And in Henry V, he says, "The strawberry grows underneath the nettle, and wholesome berries thrive and ripen best, neighboured by fruit of baser quality." And so the prince obscured his contemplation under the veil of wildness, which no doubt grew like the summer grass, fastest by night, unseen, yet crassive in his faculty.
Oof. So obviously it wasn't exactly the same bishop because
Oh, yeah.
probably a generation in between. Um,
Yeah.
but they must have grew some amazing strawberries at the Bishop of Ely's house over there. And I wonder if, and I can't keep this straight. So do you know, was Richard III written after or before Henry V?
Oh, it was written quite a while before Henry V. So Richard III usually dated 1592 to 3,
So one
and
of his
Henry V
first.
was 1599, we think. So Richard III is one of Shakespeare's earlier history plays.
So, surely Shakespeare remembered that he'd written about the strawberries in Richard III, and it's almost it, like a sort of combination callback and foreshadowing
Mm,
for
yeah,
uh, uh, this whole other scene. But if you would set this next scene for us in Richard
yes.
III.
And this scene I find quite terrifying because it shows just how cold Richard is, where he's about to execute essentially Hastings, and yet
Mhm.
he's calling for strawberries. So some critics have seen this as Richard's indifference to matters of state. Either way, I think it's quite a chilling moment. So Richard cries, "My Lord of Ely!" To which John Morton responds, "My lord." Richard says, "When I was last in Holborn, I saw rich strawberries in your garden there. I do beseech you, send for some of them." "Marry and will, my lord, with all my heart," the Lord of Ely responds. And he exits, and Richard says, "Cousin of Buckingham, a word with you," and draws him aside. "If we have sounded Hastings in our business, and finds the testy gentleman so hot as he will lose his head ere give consent, his master's son, as worshipful as he terms it, shall lose the royalty of England's throne." Buckingham says, "Withdraw you hence, my lord. I'll follow you." And then Sir William Stanley says, "We have not yet set down this day of triumph. Tomorrow, in mine opinion, is too sudden. But I myself am not so well provided as else I would be were the day prolonged." And the Bishop of Ely re-enters and says, "Where is my Lord Protector? I have sent for these strawberries." So I don't think the strawberries actually make their way onto the stage, do they? He sends for the strawberries.
I don't know. He says these strawberries. So he might be holding them in his
Mm,
hand and say, I
mm,
have sent for these strawberries. Look, everyone, strawberries. He doesn't say I have sent
yeah,
for the strawberries. So
yeah, that's true.
he's just saying, look,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
quite deictic that actually, isn't it? Yeah,
hmm
yeah.
hmm And I kind of wonder, was Richard like trying to get a man that he knew had a conscience, a man of God, out of the room while he was,
Mm,
preparing to, was he trying to get God's eyes out of the room while he's preparing to execute Hastings? Um, I don't,
yeah.
maybe he just
I d
really liked strawberries. I don't know.
well,
But
I'm struck in terms of a metaphor where when
mm,
we look at that speech in Henry V
mhm,
about the strawberry growing underneath the nettle, wholesome berries thriving and ripening best neighboured by fruits of baser quality. And perhaps this is a metaphor for the corruption of Richard's court, that there are
mm,
strawberries, delicious strawberries growing in England, but they're grown beneath baser nettles, potentially.
I think that's probably very astute. I think
Mm,
so. And so, that speaks to kind of a larger, you know, could have been a common metaphor
mm,
at the time.
mm,
Anybody who's ever grown strawberries knows you really have to get down on your hands and knees and get under all the leaves to find all the
mm.
ripe ones and hope you get there before the snails is,
Yeah.
you got to be quick. And if you pick them before they're ripe, and if you wait too long, they're gone. A bird's got them or something. So,
Mm,
so,
yeah.
well, that's interesting, though. Um, let's look at the use of strawberries in Othello now.
Yes, yes. I get very excited by the handkerchief in Othello, just to warn you.
Oh, good. Well, you'll have to tell us what's so exciting about it then, after you're done reading it.
So we have a conversation between Iago and Othello. And Iago says, Nay, but be wise. Yet we see nothing done. She may be honest yet. Tell me but this, have you not sometimes seen a handkerchief spotted with strawberries in your wife's hand? Othello says, I gave her such a one. 'Twas my first gift. I know not that, Iago says. Such a handkerchief. I am sure it was your wife's. Did I today see Cassio wipe his beard with? Othello says, if it be that, and Iago interrupts, if it be that, or any that was hers, it speaks against her with the other proofs. So here we have a handkerchief spotted with strawberries, and there was a critic named Thomas Rymer in 1693 who dismissed Othello as the tragedy of the handkerchief. He was being quite pejorative there, but I think the handkerchief is fantastic. For me, it kind of embodies the tension between the idea of providence and fate and the idea of human action and free will that was prevalent in discourse during the period, because there's a supernatural discourse surrounding this handkerchief. It was dyed in mummy. The worms were hallowed that did breathe the silk. And an Egyptian gifted this handkerchief to Othello's mother. And yet it's a human action, a trifle light as air, Amelia picking up that handkerchief that Othello's wife Desdemona lets fall and passing it to her husband Iago, that in part enables this tragedy to unravel. And I find it fascinating the amount of detail Shakespeare gives when it comes to how this prop and this symbol of fidelity looks, because I can imagine audiences at the Globe Theatre, for example, a theatre with a potential capacity of 3,000 people, when they're hearing about the detail of the handkerchief, they're craning their necks, they're straining their eyes, and just as Iago manipulates so many characters in this play, I think we're seeing Shakespeare manipulating his audience there. They're really zoning in on that handkerchief.
So kind of everything feels very big and expansive because we're here on Cyprus and there's a war going on between the Ottomans and the Venetians, and uh, somehow we're seeing all this, and it all comes down to this one little handkerchief
Mm,
that comes from all the cultures,
mm,
right? It comes from the Egyptian, the Venetian, um, the English strawberries. And we should
mm.
say that when we say it was spotted with strawberries, we mean it was embroidered. It didn't have
Yeah.
strawberry stains all over it. But the spottedness does kind of imply that juicy quality that strawberries have. And
Mm,
again, this idea that strawberries, like any berry, is an aphrodisiac and implies a deep, intimate relationship. So, in light of our kind of earlier conversation about strawberries, does that metaphor work here with Othello as uh, something of goodness and purity that can be found under a more corrupt layer?
I think it does. It's a love token. This is a gift that Othello gave to Desdemona, and it's essentially manipulated by the Machiavellian schemer in this play,
Hmm.
Iago, and used for nefarious purposes. So I've never quite thought of it in that way, but yeah, I think the strawberry metaphor stands up pretty strong in Othello. Yeah, growing amongst the nettles, and my God, there's some nasty nettles in Othello.
Oof. Yeah, it's a tough play. Um,
Mm,
I've seen a couple really good productions, and it's a hard watch,
mm,
honestly. You know what's coming, but
mm,
it's
mm,
it's so good and so timely, and also, unfortunately, horrifically racist. Um,
mm,
you know, we can't ignore that. Uh, you know, and again, they didn't really have racism. They had religionism, um, xenophobia, colorism, because they didn't understand genetics, and so they didn't think of dividing people in terms of races. That's not how they thought about it. They would have perceived Othello as an other, as a foreigner, and as someone who had converted to Christianity, and so maybe not quite trustworthy. And definitely, you know, if he wasn't a full-on Ottoman or a Turk or a Moor, then he was Venetian, and they're suspect too, according to the early modern British mind. So the whole play is very much about these kind of decadent emotions in a corrupt society. And, we can't ignore that. Uh, it is it's not a fair play in that sense. And yet, what a good one, and what a compelling narrative around spousal abuse. Um, just unflinching of, hey, you shouldn't kill your wife. Don't kill your
mm,
wife. You'll regret it. Um, and so, I like to see it performed and performed well with an understanding of the subtext, um,
mm,
that you have to be careful with in performance. And,
mm,
you know, um, it's honestly not a play that I would feel brave enough to produce,
mm.
frankly. I'd love to do a set design for it, though. Gosh, that would be fun.
Mm. Mm.
Um,
It is a play I teach probably more frequently than any other play. It's
really?
incredibly popular for A-level students in the United Kingdom. So it's probably the play I've lectured on the most, and I
Wow.
think it's a tremendous play, and you're continually learning new things every time you engage with it.
Hmm. So what is, well, you've already told us the handkerchief is your favorite part, your MacGuffin. Are you familiar with the term MacGuffin?
Of course, yeah.
Okay, good. So, well, why don't you explain it to everybody because not everybody is familiar with it.
Oh, I often think of it in filming terms.
Hmm.
So the MacGuffin in Raiders of the Lost Ark would be the Ark itself, for
Hmm.
example. So how to best describe it? It's kind of a prop
It's sort of
on which the plot pivots.
I think of it as an inciting object rather than
Yes.
an inciting event. And if you play any Dungeons and Dragons, tabletop role-playing games, there's always a MacGuffin. You always need to find, the special sword or the glowing orb or the crown or whatever it is. And that MacGuffin I think, is most interesting when it's something like a handkerchief
Mm,
that has relatively low intrinsic value. I mean, I'm sure it was a very fancy handkerchief, but
mm,
nonetheless, it's not a crown.
mm,
It's something much humbler and more intimate.
mm. Yeah, it reminds me of Love Token in Thomas Kyd's plays. So you've got a scarf in Spanish tragedy, and in Solomon and Poseidon, you've got a carcanet, which is a kind of necklace, and then the carcanet gets lost, and a character accuses another character of infidelity as a result. And
Mm,
Solomon and Poseidon is a so-called Turk play. So when we think of Turk plays, probably the most famous examples might be Christopher Marlowe's Tamburlaine.
mhm.
You've also got plays such as George Peele's The Battle of Alcazar. And I think Shakespeare's harking back to that genre with Othello, although, of course, you have that threat of Turkish violence, which you often see in the so-called Turk plays of the Elizabethan era. But that threat is ultimately displaced in Othello because the Turkish fleet is dispersed. But fascinating that the use of these love tokens in order to inform a dramatist's craftsmanship and very structure and beats of a play, I think.
I think too, when we talk about Turks and the Ottoman Empire, we should mention that Elizabeth I had a very strong alliance with Suleiman the Magnificent
Yeah.
because they both had a common enemy in the Catholics.
Mm.
And the Ottomans felt that they had uh, the only word I can think of is consanguinity, which is probably
Yeah.
not the best word, but it could
Mm.
be with the English
It's a good
because
word either way. Am I not consanguineous?
exactly, exactly, because they both had a prohibition against iconographic imagery, uh,
Mm.
and so while Shakespeare was writing, there was this interesting shift going on from where the Turks and the Moors and the Ottomans were always this scary, dangerous people to where, oh, maybe they're not so bad. Oh, boy, those embroideries are sure pretty. Look at those rugs, and more and more, uh, Turkish sailors would come here, and English people would go there and they would call it turning Turk. They would decide that
Yeah.
they wanted to be part of that. Um, and again, this is a whole other uh, thing, but I can't help but mention it. But in Twelfth Night, where Olivia decides she's only going to be around women. Her court is going to be exclusively women. And in that part of the world, in what was called Illyria then and what's Croatia now, and was Ragosa at the time, was sort of a client state of the Ottoman Empire. And I can't help but wonder if, the whole Ottoman dividing people by gender in terms of, harems and things like that. I'm sure that's not the appropriate word for it anymore, but if that's somehow reflected in Twelfth Night, where she's like, I'm going to be a Turk and only have women here, for the foreseeable future, um, which I guess, Toby and Ague Cheek don't count, but
Mm.
that's another play and another story, and I would love to
Well,
talk about.
but gluttonous character, Sir Toby
Yeah.
Belch, and
Oh,
speaking of cakes
speaking of
and
cakes and
ale,
ale, yeah.
the kind of discourse we see surrounding Falstaff, who I think
Hmm.
embodies English cuisine, essentially. He's quite a politically incorrect character, Falstaff, when we think of him today, frequently referred to as the Fat Knight. So this
Hmm.
gluttonous character, often associated with the vice figure. But I find Falstaff quite fascinating because he eats anything and everything, it seems. He
Hmm.
almost embodies a sense of nationhood where he will consume
Hmm.
things that are affiliated across different classes. And
Hmm.
when he pretends to be dead at the Battle of Shrewsbury, and Prince Hal compares him to a deer, to venison, and Falstaff has a speech about Hal essentially eating him. And I just find that so interesting in terms of the idea of consuming Falstaff. And did audiences let a surfeit of Falstaff? Were they satiated by Falstaff? Because you have him in Henry the Fourth Part One. In Henry the Fourth Part Two, you have an epilogue where Shakespeare says to the audience, if you are not cloyed with fat meat, I'll be bringing Falstaff back from Henry the Fifth. And then there is this tradition that Queen Elizabeth wanted to see more Falstaff, and Shakespeare therefore wrote The Merry Wives of Windsor. And then Falstaff's death is recounted off stage, the beginning of Henry the Fifth. So you
Hmm.
always get the sense that the audience have consumed too much of Falstaff. They've surfeited on Falstaff, and you always get the sense that the character's popularity almost grew out of control for Shakespeare. He's one
Hmm.
of the most frequently referenced characters in contemporary literature of the period. Falstaff and Hamlet are two of Shakespeare's
Yeah.
most popular roles.
Like Agatha Christie and Hercule Poirot. She's like,
Yeah,
got tired of writing about him. Well,
and Ian Fleming with James Bond as well, of course.
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly. And
yeah.
Conan Doyle and Sherlock.
Sherlock Holmes. Yeah.
Well, if we're going to talk about fat and just a little content warning, this is going to be a little bit gross here, and um, in the past, people, you need to render fat from animals to make ointments and stuff like that. And people believed that human fat had a medicinal quality. And so they would render fat from human beings and use it in ointments. I don't think they used it in cooking, let's hope, uh,
Hmm.
but they definitely used it as a medicinal ingredient, and in other industrial applications where you would use fat. I think tanning and things like that, you need fat in. And so when we're talking about Falstaff uh, being fat, he's he's a resource after his death. He's worth a lot of money
Mm.
as a rendered object. Now, people who had a real burial obviously weren't subject to that. I won't go into the types of beings that normally did get rendered because it's very sad. But perhaps that's part of his, not only is he worrying about being eaten like venison, but also melted down to
Ah,
become someone's salve.
and you were talking about the humours earlier, and I was just remembering a speech he has in The Merry Wives of Windsor, where he's speaking about his humoral disposition. He says that he's as subject to heat as butter.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, on that cheerful note,
Well, I wonder if we could finish off. We're doing an episode on what was on Shakespeare's menu,
yeah.
and I don't think we could finish the episode without mentioning the pie in Titus
Oh, please.
Andronicus.
Yes.
And Shakespeare often explores that notion of cannibalism in terms of corrupt society. So
Mm.
thinking of King Lear when he says that men will perforce feed on each other like monsters of the deep. And with Titus Andronicus, you've got this emperor Saturninus. So think of Saturn, that mythological figure who consumes his own children. You've got a society that is described as a wilderness of tigers. And Shakespeare goes back to his Roman tragedian, Lucius Annaeus Seneca, particularly Thyestes, who's tricked by his brother Atreus into consuming his sons, and also Book 6 of Ovid's
Mm.
Metamorphoses, where you have King Tereus tricked into eating his son, baked in a pie. And the famous, notorious, infamous conclusion to Titus Andronicus is Chiron and Demetrius being ground down into pastry, and their mother Tamara being tricked into eating them. And Tamara says, "Where are Chiron and Demetrius?" To which Titus responds, "Why, there they are, baked in this pie whereof their mother daintily hath fed, eating the flesh that she herself hath bred." So this is a very striking moment that whenever Titus Andronicus is performed,
Mm.
you'll often see the poster for the production is just an image of a pie. It's something that we instantly associate with that play. But what's quite interesting in terms of Shakespeare's feasts is often there are no explicit references to what is being consumed
Hmm.
at the feast. You think of Macbeth, for
Hmm.
instance, and there's no food. You were mentioning Timon's feast earlier, where you've got pebbles, warm water. In The Tempest, there are some viands left for the Neapolitan characters, and then a quaint device makes a banquet table disappear. So Titus Andronicus is one of the exceptions, I think, in the Shakespeare canon. But I think banquets, feasts,
Hmm.
they serve really important social purposes that in drama can quite easily devolve into chaos. We see in John Marston's play, Antonio's Revenge, the final set piece of that play is a wedding feast where the murderous Duke gets repeatedly stabbed, has his tongue cut out. I was thinking of John Ford's "'Tis Pity She's a Whore," where at a feast you have the character Giovanni enters with his sister's heart on a knife. And you also have some cannibalistic set pieces, a bit like Titus Andronicus, the Bloody Banquet, played by
Hmm.
Thomas Middleton and Thomas Dekker, where a queen is forced to consume her lover. So they're very prominent in plays of the period, these feasts. And if they ever are explicit on what's being consumed at the feast, it tends to be human flesh, actually, quite
So,
curiously.
so my squeamishness about Falstaff possibly being rendered for for fat is totally out of place in this discussion, and I should just embrace that.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
That is really interesting. So, well, and then when we're talking about a feast, I think that's true. Um, and then you have to wonder too, how much of that is just due to the impracticality of having actors eating?
Yeah, yeah. And in terms of sourcing those foods, and if you're being very specific in terms of what's being
Hmm.
brought on stage, yeah, I think Shakespeare is very much a practical man of the theatre, so I'm not surprised that his plays in particular seldom mention what exactly is being consumed. You might get some references to alcohol,
Yes,
but you can easily represent that with the goblet, for instance.
or with alcohol.
Or with alcohol. I mean, the audience are consuming alcohol, and
You
that's
have,
worth touching upon. Actually, is that the audience are consuming not just the plays, but they're also
mhm.
potentially eating shellfish, hazelnuts. They're drinking ale potentially in the theatre. They might have nuts and berries they can use as missiles.
Yes. Yeah, they couldn't throw tomatoes, but they could throw rotten apples.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah, that's a good point. All right. So we have our question, what was on Shakespeare's menu? And apparently it was human flesh with the occasional cakes and ale.
Yeah, I think in terms of Shakespeare's menu, it's very diverse. I've been so fascinated to learn from you, Rachel, in terms of what are the connotations of some of the
Mm.
foodstuffs mentioned in Shakespeare. And sometimes, even if nothing is explicit on the menu, a feast, as we've concluded, can serve a very important social and dramaturgical purpose.
Definitely. All right. I think it's time for Writer's Corner.
Yes, yes. So tell me, what are you up to at the moment?
Well, in the last episode, I was very excited because I thought that my book was on the brink of being published. But,
Ah,
I forgot that, traditional publishing moves a little slower than self-publishing does when you can just push a button and there it is on the evil retailer website. So my books are not going to be out until January of 2027.
oh,
And so we have plenty of time.
I can't wait that long, Rachel. That is,
Oh, thank you.
yes, yes. You must
Well,
send me advance copies.
well, maybe I think you've earned an advance copy, definitely. Definitely.
I'm sorry to
Uh,
hear that, but it will be worth the wait.
well,
It
thank
would
you.
definitely be
Thank
worth the
you.
wait.
And it gives me more time to tell people about it, so that's good. And
Yeah, yeah.
for all of you out there, if you know any writer you want to support, um, eh, pre-orders are the
Mm,
lifeblood of any author. So this
mm,
will give me a chance when it can be pre-ordered to shout that far and wide. But
mm,
right now, and so that book is Shakespeare's Influences.
mm.
Uh, the influences behind I've forgotten my own title. Um, it's called The Influences Behind Shakespeare's Plays by R.K. Aanstad. In case you're watching this after 2027 and you can just Google it, that's what it's called. And I'm in the process of writing another book called Shakespeare's Cast, the historical figures behind Shakespeare's plays, and that one will be released at the same time because it's sort of the stepchild of the first one, where
Ah,
it was a chapter that was 30,000 words long, and I was like, uh-oh, this is its own book. And
mm,
so in that book, I start with Troilus and Cressida. So we're starting with the Iliad, and then come down through Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, and then I indulge in taking a detour into Macbeth because it is quasi-historical, and I think it
Mm,
occupies a really interesting place as an invented history,
mm,
um, as propaganda for the Stuart court. I won't go too far down that path today, but anyway, Macbeth is there. And then we have what I call a plague of Plantagenets, and start with the life and death of King John and go all the way through all the Richards and all the Henrys, uh,
mm,
all the way to the bottom. And this is how the book started, was I was just trying to keep these people straight in my head. You know, you've got a Duke of Norfolk here and a Duke of Norfolk there, and an Earl of Surrey here. And is that the same Earl of Surrey that's over there? And no, they're 100 years apart. So what's going on here? And so I basically started writing these little biographies of each of these characters. And then sometimes I write a biography where I think it's important. Like I start out with Edward III and Philippa of Hainault
mm,
because it all comes from them. It's all because they had too many babies, is the whole reason that the Wars of the Roses happens, basically. And
mm,
uh, what I found in learning to really understand and appreciate these plays is that you have to start at the beginning of that line of people. And then it all starts to make a lot more sense. And so basically, I have this timeline starts with Eleanor of Aquitaine and then jumps to Edward III and Philippa when we get into the Wars of the Roses kind of preamble. Uh,
mm,
what I have found is, of course, a lot of fascinating characters that are interesting, have always been interesting, compelling, Richard III, and, so on. So many of these named characters are important, fascinating people that add context to the story that just have no idea. I mean, especially as somebody living in the United States who did not grow up consuming the Wars of the Roses as part of my birthright
mm,
necessarily. From what I understand, people in Britain pick a side very early on, whether they're
mm.
a Yorkist or a Lancastrian. Is that true where you are, or is that just in people who live in those regions now, do you think?
Interesting question. I mean, the Richard III Society is very prominent, so you
Right.
certainly have a lot
But
of people.
putting that aside, this idea that someone is a Yorkist or a Lancastrian based
Mm,
on where they were born. Uh,
mm.
I've
Yeah,
heard
I think that would make sense. Is I'm from Wales, so yeah, I could
you
probably
don't have a dog in that fight.
I can identify more with Richmond, I think.
Oh,
Yeah,
sure,
yeah,
sure, sure,
yeah. But
sure.
it's not a side I would take.
No.
It wouldn't make any sense for me to. But yeah, I don't meet many people who say, "Oh, I'm a Yorkist or I'm a Lancastrian." But I'll keep an eye out.
Well, I have run into, I belong to some Facebook groups and there's a couple medieval ones, and there are people there with very strong feelings about being one or the other. I mean, it's good
Oh,
natured. It's like a sports team kind of
oh,
a
okay. Yeah.
thing. It's not like I'm going to, avenge the death of, whoever. Um, but in any event, all that aside, there's some wonderful characters in there, and I would wager that even people who grew up studying the Wars of the Roses probably don't know who Dr. Butts is. Like they probably have no idea
Mm,
what a fantastic guy Dr. Butts was because he was super cool. So I'm
mm,
enjoying that process very much and
mm,
working to organize the information in such a way that really adds context to the plays. And I have a few weeks left. I have 6 weeks before that is
ah,
due. So I've been very focused on that. And What are you working on?
Well, it's very exciting. I very recently had an article published that concerned several plays we've discussed today, from Titus Andronicus to Timon of Athens to Macbeth. It's an article in Shakespeare Journal titled Authorship Attributions in Middleton's Canon, with the subheading Collaboration, Revision, and Shakespeare Descriptions. So it's an article that's offering something of a state of the field survey of arguments for Thomas Middleton, Shakespeare's younger contemporary, his relationship with Shakespeare, from co-authorship in Timon of Athens to series that he adapted, plays such as Macbeth and Measure for Measure. And I've been very gradually chipping away at my Shakespeare and Panto book. So over the past couple of evenings, I've been working on a chapter concerning monsters.
Ooh.
So looking at writings and beliefs when it comes to dragons and particular exotic and sometimes crazy creatures that you will find in the likes of Pliny's Natural History or on maps of the period. And I've been writing a little bit on Caliban. It's a
Mhm.
servant monster, as
Mhm.
Ben Jonson terms him in Bartholomew Fair. And I'll be linking that to the idea of monsters in British pantomime, from dragons to ogres, and thinking about the desire in a lot of modern British pantomimes to redeem the monsters, and how we could have a look at Shakespeare's complex characterization, the heaps of contradictions, the redeeming characteristics of some of the monsters that Shakespeare depicts on stage. So I'm just chipping away at that, and it's a thoroughly enjoyable book to be working on.
Oh, I'm so looking forward to it. That's awesome.
Me too.
We write the books that we want to read.
Yes, yeah,
That's what motivates us. That's what, when we happen to wake up at 3 a.m. and think, oh, we've got a couple quiet hours, we can write.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Mm.
exciting. All righty, so now let's talk about books that other people have written.
Yes. Well, this was such a fun topic that, as you know, I was a little bit apprehensive because
Yeah.
I don't pretend to be an expert in terms of early modern food, but I've learned so much speaking to you and reading around the topic. So, one book that I took a look at was Joan Fitzpatrick's Food in Shakespeare,
Mm-hmm.
Early Modern Dietaries and the Plays, and that was published by Routledge in 2007. And one scholar I've been engaging with quite a lot recently, um, incredibly productive, brilliant scholar. I've been engaging with in part for the Shakespeare and Panto book, just on multiple fronts and in quite diverse topics, is Todd Borlik, who has an essay titled The Chameleon's Dish, Shakespeare and the Omnivore's Dilemma, which was published in Early Modern Studies Journal in 2009. And that's where I got my information about the belief that chameleons could feed on the air. And there's another essay in the same journal issue, which is by Joshua Fisher, and is titled "Digesting Falstaff: Food and Nation in Shakespeare's Henry IV Plays." And I found that fascinating because it's not just an exploration of what Falstaff consumes, but it's also an exploration of us consuming Falstaff, and also Prince Howell's perceived hunger for the throne, and
Mm-hmm.
how Falstaff's diet ties into our sense of nationhood. And just as a final recommendation for anyone interested in delving deeper into Titus Andronicus, which is curiously one of my favorite plays, but I have to recommend Jonathan Bate's edition of that play, and especially the revised edition published by Bloomsbury in 2018.
All right. Well, let's see. You nabbed one of the books that I was going to
Oh, really?
recommend. So that's awesome. I got plenty. I got plenty. Let's see. So one of the ones that I want to recommend is let's see, it's by David Goldstein and Amy Tigner, Culinary Shakespeare, Staging Food and Drink in Early Modern England, University Park, Penn State University Press, blah, 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 2016. And there's a wonderful book. It's Food in Early Modern England, Phases, Fads, and Fashions, 1500 to 1760, by Joan Thirsk. And that was, that's London Continuum, 2009. We'll have links to all these, both on the website and in the show notes. There's a wonderful new book called Eating with the Tudors by uh, Bridget Webster, and that's put out by Pen and Sword, who are my publishers. So they are wonderful. They have so many excellent books. If you're interested in any aspect of history, go check out their catalog. I have another book here called Fabulous Feasts, Medieval Cookery and Ceremony, and that is by Madeline Pellner Cosman. Um, I'm not going to bother with the publisher right there because you can just link it below. Um, Here's another one called Plain Delit. And well, you're looking at it up there so you know how it's spelled. Medieval Cookery for Modern Cooks, second edition. So if you're interested in trying medieval food, this is a wonderful resource. And uh, there's a wonderful book called Food in England by Dorothy Hartley, and I am going to give you the publisher on that, Piatkus, 2009. And there's a lot in here that is food after the Columbian Exchange, and even, after the 19th century. Like, she's very thorough here. But a lot of these foods are incredibly traditional and, easily go back to the medieval and or have been, adjusted since then for more modern ingredients. And I recommend it highly. It is actually my most useful and used book when researching food in this period, because she describes it so well and in such a good context. She's just a really, really good writer. And finally, there's a wonderful book that I used in talking about pepper. It's called Pepper, A History of the World's Most Influential Spice by Marjorie Schaefer, and that's St. Martin's Press, 2013. And it's a beautiful book and a beautifully written book, and I recommend it highly.
Well, plenty to feed your knowledge there. I think
Yes,
there's quite an
quite a stack of books.
extensive list of books on a very tasty topic. And what we've reached the end of our second episode, Rachel.
We have.
And we have. And thanks and ever thanks to those of you watching and listening to Shakespeare and Friends. And until the next time, it's a warm farewell from Rachel and me.
Bye.